Hi, it's Kirsty from Lloyd's Sewing, and in this video we're going to have a look at the dual feed foot and the additional accessories that you can get to go with it. Now the dual feed foot is in a sense a walking foot, but it's a more advanced version of the walking foot. So your walking foot has a feed dog on the top as well that runs with the feed dogs underneath to help pull your layers of fabric through. It's used for quilting, but you can also use it if you're working with slippery fabrics and awkward fabrics as well. Now the dual feed foot, instead of having the feed dogs on the top, it has this motorised rubber belt that actually feeds your fabric through. So the back part here, that is actually the motor, and that plugs into the back of the machine, which I'll show you in a moment. And then here, this is the motorised rubber belt that actually rotates and moves around as the machine is sewing. In the box, you get your instructions on how to use it. You get the standard foot with it as well. And then underneath here, we get the actual dual feed foot itself. Okay, so I'll show you all that in more detail in a little while, but let's have a look at some of the accessories that you can get to go with it as well. So you can actually get interchangeable feet. So whereas with a walking foot you can get a standard walking foot and then you can get an open toe walking foot, the dual feed foot has interchangeable clip-on feet. So we can get an open toe foot for it, but we can also get a stitch in the ditch foot, and we can get a 1/4 inch foot as well. And again, I will show you later on in the video how we can actually attach these onto the foot and the different purposes that we could use them for. A couple of other accessories that you can get as well is the couching dual feed foot. So this is a couching attachment that works with the dual feed foot, and it's for couching on yarns and decorative threads. So that's more of a creative technique and skill that you can use with the dual feed foot. And then you can also get the dual feed quilting guide as well. And you can get a quilting guide for the walking foot, but not a lot of people know that it's actually something that's available. And what the quilting guide is, I don't know if you'll be able to see it on here, but it's a little guide. You get two, one for either side of the dual feed foot, depending on which side you're working on. And it's for if you're quilting parallel lines or diamond quilting, anything like that. And you can use these as guides for your previous stitch lines that you've done. So you would do one stitch line, and then you set your guide at the distance that you want your stitch lines to be. So if you were doing them an inch apart, you can set that to be an inch away. And then you would do your second line and then move along and do your third line and continue doing your parallel line quilting like that. Okay. Now what I'm going to show you is how we can use it on some actual projects. I've got some items here that have already been made up, so as well as quilting, as I said, you can use it for other projects as well. A lot of people think that the dual feed attachment and a walking foot style attachment is only for quilting, but it's not the case. It's also great in dressmaking if we're working with jersey fabrics. Jersey can be a really awkward fabric to work with at times, and the dual feed foot can help to keep those layers together. And then it's also really good for working with slippery, awkward fabrics like crepe and chiffon and rayon as well, and viscose fabrics. So this is a dress that I made, and the dual feed foot really helped to stop those fabric layers from shifting, because it's a slippery fabric and it's the kind of fabric that is likely to shift. So silks and satins as well, it works really well for those kind of projects. So let's have a look at the dual feed foot in action. Now this is it out of its box with the standard foot that it comes with. And as I said earlier, these feet clip on and off to change them. They really do clip on and off easily. All we do is clip them on and off like that. So if we want to change to any of the other feet, which we will do later on, that's how easy it is to change those. Now I'm going to be using this on the V5 LE today, and some of you will actually already have this. So the dual feed kit, as it's called, and the standard foot. It comes as standard with the V7, the XV, the XJ1 and also the XP1 luminaire. But you can buy this as an extra for the V5, the V5 LE and also the VQ2 sewing only machine. So those of you who already have it with your machines, you may be interested in some of those extra feet that you can get for it. And those of you who have a V5 or a VQ2, you might be interested in the whole kit. Okay, so let's attach this onto the machine. Now, the first thing we have to do is you have to remove your presser foot holder from the shank here. And then we're going to attach the foot onto the shank. Okay, so you do find at the back when you first start using this foot it's a little bit cumbersome, and I think everybody will say that, but once you get using it you don't notice it as much anymore. So I'm popping that onto the shank, tightening up the screw, and then I'm just going to use my Brother multifunction screwdriver, the multi-purpose screwdriver, just to tighten that up. Okay, and then the final thing we need to do is plug the cable into the back of the machine here. If we're able to get round there with the camera, we'll get that plugged in like so. Okay, so it takes its power from the machine and then that's what powers the motorised rubber belt here. Okay, so now if we come over to the screen, so we're going to go into sewing mode, and you can see straight away it recognises that I've got the dual feed foot on, and that's because it's plugged in at the back of the machine. Because it recognises that we've got the dual feed foot on, it will only let me do certain stitches. So if I go into this decorative stitch area and go down onto the second page, I know that all of these stitches are greyed out, and if I try selecting one of those, it will say that it's not dual feed mode compatible. Okay, so it's always going to let you know if certain stitches aren't compatible to use with the foot. But for now, I'm just going to do a centre straight stitch, and what I've got here is 2 layers of fabric and a layer of wadding, and I just want to show you how easily it feeds through and how smooth the stitching is. So I've got my fabric layers underneath the foot, and I'm just going to lower the foot down so we can see that our belt at the back here is now on our fabric. It's got contact with our fabric, and when I press the start button we'll just start sewing, and I'm not having to push this fabric through at all. It's feeding through very smoothly. Those of you who already have a dual feed foot will be aware that it does make a bit of a funny noise as it's working. I don't know whether the camera will pick that up or the mic will pick that up, but it's just the motorised rubber belt feeding the fabric through. So it's perfectly normal if it makes a bit of a squeaky noise. And then I'll just come back down the other side here and I'll speed it up as well so you can see that it copes with it at a higher speed as well. And there we go. So what we've got there is the 2 layers of fabric, the layer of wadding in between. My stitch length was 2.5, and you can just see how smooth that is. There's no puckers in the fabric at all. There's no basting there. I know that obviously this is only a small piece of fabric, but we're going to test it on a bigger quilt in a moment as well. But the fabric just hasn't shifted and it just fed through the machine so smoothly. So now let's take a look at the open toe foot for the dual feed foot. I'm going to take off my standard foot, and all I do is just pull that down so that just clips off, and then I'm going to attach the open toe one instead. Now you can see the difference between these two. They've both got the guideline markings on them, but this one is the standard one with the closed toe, and this one is the open toe one with the open area here. Now the little markings that are on them, this red line at the back here, that is where the needle start position is. So where the needle will come down, that's in line with the needle. And then this line here is 1/8 of an inch away from that, and then this line at the front here, that's 1/4 of an inch away from where the needle would be. So if you're doing any outline quilting, or you know, you need to know where your start point is going to be, that's when those will be helpful. Now, the extra feet do come with instructions. They let you know what all these guidelines are, so you don't need to worry about keeping watching this video to find out what they are. You've got all the instructions there that has all the information for the foot. So then we will attach the open toe foot on, and all I do is I just line up these 2 bars with the clips here and just clip that in place, as easy as that. And what I'm going to do now is some top stitch quilting on this piece, and I have drawn on with a chalk guideline where I want my top quilting to be. Now, for something like this, we could use either of the feet. So the standard foot might work quite well, because you might feel that you want to send that chalk guideline down the centre there and have your needle position in the centre. But if we use the open toe foot, we've just got a more open space, and I'll actually be able to see where the needle is coming down and feeding that line in, okay? So just on a centre straight stitch, I'm just going to increase my stitch length to 3mm for my quilting. Bring the speed down a little bit. And it's just feeding it through with no problem at all. And all I'm doing is my chalk line that's on here, I'm just using that as a guide for where my stitch line is going to be. And I can tell that those layers of the fabric, they just aren't shifting at all. The stitching is so smooth and my fabric hasn't shifted. And if we just have a quick look at the back, you can see there as well, again, the fabric hasn't shifted at all. And that's because we've got the feed dogs on the bottom pulling that layer of fabric through, and then the belt on the top pulling our top layer of fabric through. So in the same way that I've drawn the chalk lines on here and we've just quilted this line down here on this small piece, I want to show you a finished piece that I did using the dual feed foot. Now I had a tiny little bit of free motion just in these blocks here, but the rest of it was quilted using the dual feed foot, and I used a combination of the standard foot and the open toe one. So we've got lots of straight line quilting, parallel lines, and then lots of curved lines as well, following the contours of the curved blocks within the quilt. And I used a variety of the different feet depending on which area I was working with. So with these areas here, I marked them on in chalk first, and then I used the standard foot for those ones to feed them through. And then the open toe one I used when doing areas like this because I could set the needle position in a certain spot and then use the inner guides of the foot to be able to go the equal distance on either side there. So the whole quilt was done using the dual feed foot, and it's the flattest quilt I've ever done as well. And what I mean by that is that there was no puckering in it at all. Obviously you keep pressing as you're going along, get rid of any wrinkles, but there's a lot of stitching on there, and the dual feed foot just made it so easy to work with. Now sometimes when you're doing your quilting, you don't want to do top stitching and you don't want your stitch lines to be visible, and you want to do stitch in the ditch instead. And the easiest way to do that is using the stitch in the ditch dual feed foot. So you can see here what we have is this little guide, this black piece of metal, and that would match up when you've got the needle in the central position. That guide will match up with the needle position. And what you will do is you put this guide in the ditch of the fabric. And again, as with the other feet, you get your instructions here. It reminds you where you need to have your needle position. But I'm going to attach this foot on. Just by clipping it on. And we don't have a gap on this foot to be able to pull your thread through on the same way as the other feet. So that's just something to be aware of when you're using it. Okay, I'm going to bring this quilt over here. So what I'm going to do is I want to stitch in the ditch down this line here, down this seam. So the first thing I'm going to do is just pull my thread up to the top. So I'm just going to use the wheel on the side just to bring the needle down so I can just check it's in the right position, and then press the needle down button, and then press that again, and then pull that thread up to the top. And the reason I'm doing that is so that I can then bury those threads into the quilt afterwards and I don't end up with a little knot of thread underneath. So it's going to be a nice neat finish both top and bottom. So we'll bring that down, bring the foot down, and we can see now that the guide on the foot is going in the ditch. So that is what stitch in the ditch is. It's stitching in the ditch of the seam here. I'm going to bring my speed down here because I don't want to run away with me. So what I'm doing now is, instead of looking at where the needle is stitching, I'm actually looking at the guide at the front here instead. So you may want to make sure that you've got, your quilt is nice and loose and flexible. You don't want anything holding that down because you want it to be able to feed it through. You don't want anything pulling that quilt back. So all I'm doing is looking at the guide at the front instead. And it may seem a little bit odd to not be looking at the needle at all, but you just need to trust that the foot is going to do the work for you. So I'm looking at the guide all the time and just keeping that in line. Now my little thread ends are starting to get towards the end there, so I'm just going to raise the foot and just pull them through, pull them out of the way, and then carry on going. Okay, so we're just getting to the end of this seam here. And I want to keep going until I'm able to see this seam here in line with the red markers there, and that's when I know that my needle's at the end position. like that. Okay, and I'm just going to do a little lock stitch in place. I'm not going to use the scissors function. What I'm going to do is just pull my thread out, cut that on both sides, and then I'll be able to pull that thread up to the top in a bit, and then I'll bury my threads in. But you can just see there the stitch in the ditch going all the way along, and hopefully we shouldn't be able to see that. It should be invisible, but I can guarantee that we have stitched all the way along there.
Done.
So this is the underside of the quilt that we've just done when we've done the stitch in the ditch line. And you can see no puckering at all. Now the final foot to take a look at here is the 1/4 inch foot for the dual feed kit. Now this is the 1/4 inch foot, and you can see it's got the guide on it here, similar to the stitch in the ditch one, but rather than being in the centre, it's off to the side here. And if you have your needle position in the centre, this guide is 1/4 inch away from where that needle position will be. Now within the instructions, again, you get the instructions with this foot. Down at the bottom here, there is a little chart, and it lets you know what the seam allowance will be from this guide, depending on where you have the needle position. So I'm going to have the needle position in the centre, which is at 3.5 mil for the needle position here, which is 1/4 inch. But if you want it to be 1/8 inch seam, you would move the needle position to 6.75. If you want to do a 7 mil seam, which is 9/32 of an inch, you would have the needle position at 3 mil, or if you want it to be a 1 centimetre seam, which is approximately 3/8 of an inch, you would have the needle position at 0. Okay, so again, they come with the foot. Now, what I've got here is a little piece of a Quilt As You Go project. So I've got the wadding here, I've got my 2 layers of fabric, and I want to do a 1/4 inch seam. Now, I could just use a normal 1/4 inch foot, but because we've got the different layers here and the wadding as well, I want to use the dual feed foot instead, but I still need that 1/4 inch seam guide. Clip the foot in place. We know by now how easily they attach on and off, and again, we don't have that opening to feed the thread through, so you've got to be aware that that's just going to be going through the opening here. What you could always do, if you felt like it, is always feed it underneath and pull it through like so. Okay, so I've got my needle position in the centre, and I'll just show you the setting that I've got for my stitch on the screen over here. Okay, so I have my needle position in the centre here. The width is at 3.5, that means that the needle position is in the centre because I'm on a centre straight stitch, and the length I've just got at 2.5 mil. And then with the foot, what I'm going to do is I'm putting the edge of my fabric against the inner edge here of this guide. Pop the foot down. And all I'm doing is using that as a guide all the way down for my 1/4 inch seam. So we can see there we've got the 1/4 inch seam on the Quilt As You Go, and all we do is then press that over to the side and then carry on with the rest of your blocks. Now there's another little feature that I've not mentioned about the dual feed foot yet, and it's this little lever on the inside here. And what that does is if we raise that up, you can see that it actually raises up the belt. So that means when you then put that down on your fabric and you put the foot down, that belt is no longer touching the fabric. You might think, well, why would you need that? Now, if we were doing just a normal seam, reuse this bit of fabric, we'll just come down this side instead. just going through a couple of layers of stable cotton fabric like this, we don't necessarily need this dual feed foot on, okay? So we can then use it just as a normal foot, and we can see it's not actually moving the belt anymore because we've deactivated it by raising that lever. So now I'm just using it as a normal foot. So you may think, well, you know, you're going to have to be changing your foot often, but actually you could keep this foot on for most of your projects that you do and just deactivate the dual feed belt when you don't need it. And what I like about that foot, just even as a standard foot, or well, you know, any of these feet, is because they're wider, you do have better coverage on your fabric, so the feed does feel improved anyway.
Okay.
Thank you for watching Lloyd's sewing video on the dual feed foot and all of its lovely accessories.